1944, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, the screams started long before dawn, and for a moment Ada Newman truly believed the Nazi officers had been right all along, that the Americans would peel the flesh from their bones and carve confessions out of them as soon as they reached shore. A young German woman named Greta tried to hurl herself over the side of the transport ship, convinced it was better to drown than fall into American hands. Ada grabbed her wrist just in time, her fingers slipping on the salt-wet skin as sailors shouted in broken German for calm. The ship lurched, metal groaning, and Greta kept sobbing that she wouldn't let American devils touch her. The officers back in France had painted such terrifying pictures that Ada herself could barely breathe, even though she had always considered herself rational, logical, steady. But the ocean had a way of crushing certainty. The smell of rust, diesel, sweat, and fear became one choking cloud around the women packed inside the dark hold. Every sound felt like an omen. Every footstep from above sounded like a hammer building her coffin. Ada pressed herself against the cold steel wall and whispered to calm Greta, though her own heart hammered violently. The year was 1944, and the world had already gone mad, but Ada sensed that whatever awaited them in America might tear her mind open in ways even Nazi propaganda hadn't prepared her for. Her journal, hidden in the lining of her coat, held pages of coded notes she had written since the moment she'd been separated from her students in Dresden. She had been a schoolteacher, firm but fair, shaped by years of state instruction about the Reich's enemies. American soldiers were not human, she had been told. They were monsters with white smiles concealing sadistic appetites. They cut hair to make wigs. They starved prisoners. They experimented on women. Ada had believed enough of it to tremble now as the ship's whistle blared and the coastline of Louisiana came into view. The sun was rising behind it, red and swollen, as if warning her she was stepping into the open mouth of something much worse than war. When the women were ordered onto the deck, Ada felt Greta's hand gripping hers like a vice. All around them, gaunt faces stared toward the dock where American military police waited. Ada braced herself for barking, gun barrels, blood. She tugged Greta slightly behind her, her protective instinct rising as the first American soldier stepped forward. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't even frowning. He simply instructed them to descend the gangway slowly, one line at a time. His voice was calm, even gentle. That frightened Ada more. Kindness, in her mind, was bait. She glanced at the other guards. No one shouted. No one shoved. Several even nodded as if greeting guests rather than enemy civilians. Her suspicion deepened into panic. This was wrong. Terribly wrong. The Americans were pretending to be civilized. The trap would come later, when the women were isolated. Ada scanned their uniforms, decoding insignias automatically, searching for hidden weapons. She whispered to Greta, telling her to avoid eye contact, not to speak, not to accept anything. The ride from the harbor to Camp Ruston took them past quiet fields, green and peaceful in the summer heat. Ada wanted the chaos of war, ruins, smoke, rubble, because at least chaos made sense. Peace was more dangerous. Peace meant they were being softened. Prepared. The trucks rolled up to a high fence of barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at the corners, exactly as she expected, but the guards inside looked bored rather than predatory. Ada felt sweat trickling down her spine as she stepped out with the others. A woman beside her whispered, astonished, "They are not shouting at us." Ada hissed for her to stay quiet. She didn't understand why the lack of cruelty felt more terrifying than visible malice. Inside the processing building, the air was warm and filled with steam. The women froze collectively. Bathhouses were where, according to the warnings, Americans began their punishments. Ada felt bile rise in her throat. A group of American Army nurses, women in pressed uniforms, hair neatly pinned, approached slowly. One of them spoke through a translator. She said they would be disinfected, bathed, fed, and given fresh clothes. Fresh clothes. Clean towels. Soap. Oil for dry skin. Ada stared in disbelief, her mind racing to turn these gentle words into something sinister. Greta took a hesitant step forward. Ada yanked her back. The nurses exchanged confused looks. Ada backed against the wall, heart pounding so loudly she heard it in her ears. She expected hands grabbing her. Instead, the nurses stepped back, giving her space. Then a deeper voice cut through the steam. "Miss, you're safe here. No one will harm you." Ada's entire body locked. Slowly she turned. Standing a few feet away was Colonel Joseph W. Scobie, the commanding officer of Camp Ruston. His posture was straight, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes were steady, calm, unreadable. There was no hostility. No mockery. No hidden threat. The shock was so intense that Ada felt her knees nearly buckle. Safe. The word echoed inside her skull like a foreign object forced into place. Safe. Nothing in her training, nothing in the propaganda she'd been fed for years, prepared her for an American officer speaking to her not with triumph or cruelty, but with quiet reassurance. It made no sense. It rattled her more deeply than any act of violence could have. Because if this was true, if she was safe, then everything she believed might be a lie. And Ada Newman would rather die than live in a world where she could no longer trust her own mind. Ada woke before sunrise, long before the others stirred in their bunks, her eyes snapping open in the pale Louisiana darkness. The barracks were quiet except for the soft breathing of frightened women who had cried themselves to sleep after the shock of the previous day. Ada lay still, staring at the wooden beams above her, replaying Colonel Scobie's words again and again until they knotted into something unbearable. Safe. The word clung to her like a parasite. It contradicted everything she had been taught, everything she had repeated to her students, everything she had believed as truth. In its place grew a gnawing suspicion that seeped into her bones. If the Americans wanted to deceive them, what better way than kindness? Poison tasted sweetest when offered gently. She pushed herself upright and glanced at Greta, curled tightly like a child, clutching a thin blanket as if it were armor. The other women slept with similar tension, their faces smoothing only slightly now that exhaustion had conquered their terror. Ada slipped from her bunk and pressed her ear against the barracks wall. Distant footsteps crunched on gravel outside, regular and steady, the rhythm of trained guards on patrol. Nothing suspicious. Nothing violent. That alone made her uneasy. In her mind, danger should have been loud. Predictable. Cruel. This measured calmness was something far worse. She reached into her coat and retrieved her pocket journal, the small pages filled with coded German shorthand she had invented during her teaching years. She scribbled quickly, writing about guard rotations, the absence of aggression, and the unnatural politeness of the American staff. Underlined twice was a single sentence: "They smile too much." When the women were finally awakened from morning roll, Ada watched them carefully. Some looked less tense. A few even whispered among themselves, relieved that they hadn't been harmed. Ada tightened her grip on her journal. She had to stay alert, even if the others were weakening. She forced herself into line, her back straight, her eyes sharp. 2 American guards stood by the exit, talking softly about something she couldn't hear. One of them laughed. The sound drifted through the barracks like something alien. Ada studied their posture, their hands, their weapons. They looked relaxed, almost casual. Another tactic, she thought. Appear harmless. Lower defenses. Strike later. The group was led toward the infirmary building for medical inspection and cleaning. The sunlight was warm on Ada's face, but she barely noticed. She focused on the soldiers positioned around the yard. None had rifles pointed at them. None barked orders. One even nodded politely when the line passed. Ada's stomach twisted painfully. The gentleness felt like a trap concealed beneath silk. When they reached the infirmary entrance, an American nurse, Evelyn Tully, greeted them with a tired smile. Her uniform was crisp, her hands steady, her expression composed. She spoke through a translator, explaining that they would receive ointment for cracked skin and be checked for illnesses. Several women exhaled shakily in relief. Ada did not. When Nurse Tully approached her, Ada stepped back, fists clenched, breath sharp. But the nurse did not force anything. She simply waited, offering a small tin of oil, explaining its purpose with patient calm. Ada hesitated, then reluctantly extended her hand. The nurse worked silently, rubbing the warm oil gently into Ada's palm and fingers. The sensation startled her. The warmth softened her skin, but it also softened something inside her she didn't want touched. She pulled her hand away quickly, muttering that she didn't need American kindness. The nurse didn't react. She simply nodded and moved to the next woman. Ada watched her suspiciously. Why such gentleness? Why such attention to comfort? It was unnatural for a nation at war. There had to be an ulterior motive. She scanned the room, observing the guards stationed near the door. One was reading a newspaper. Another leaned against the wall, expression neutral. No threat. No tension. Ada scribbled in her journal again. They pretend to be bored. That is the moment they attack. The women were guided to the dining hall next, a long room with wooden tables and benches. The smell of food wafted through the air, thick and unexpected. Ada froze at the threshold. Inside, American cooks spooned steaming vegetable stew into metal bowls, setting aside bread and apples for each woman. Greta whispered that it smelled wonderful, and Ada hissed at her to stay quiet. But even she felt hunger clawing at her stomach. She had barely eaten for days, and the warm scent of potatoes and herbs weakened her resolve. An American cook, a broad-shouldered man with rolled-up sleeves, placed a bowl in front of her and said gently, "Eat before it gets cold." Ada stared at him, unsure how to respond. He didn't look like a murderer. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a tired man doing his job. That frightened her far more. She reluctantly sat down, the wooden bench creaking. The other women dug into their food immediately, tears streaking down some of their cheeks as the warmth spread through their empty stomachs. Ada lifted a spoonful hesitantly, sniffing it, searching for bitterness or chemical smell. It smelled normal. Comforting even. That made her suspicious. She swallowed it anyway, slow and deliberate. Nothing happened. No dizziness. No choking. Just warmth spreading through her chest. Ada's eyes darted to the doorway where a young American soldier entered. He glanced around the room, then spotted a small German girl at the far end who looked barely 16. Without a word, he pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket and placed it in front of her. The girl gasped as if she'd been handed treasure. Ada gripped her spoon so tightly her knuckles whitened. Why would an enemy give chocolate to a prisoner? It made no sense. Nothing fit the narrative she had been taught. She finished her meal mechanically, every bite deepening her confusion. When the women returned to their barracks, Ada lingered outside for a moment, eyes narrowed, scanning for patterns, signals, anything that would reveal the truth behind this bizarre kindness. But she found nothing. The guards nodded politely again. One wished her a good afternoon. The translator explained that the women would soon receive new clothes. Ada froze at that. New clothes? Why? To make them comfortable? To calm them? To break them? She hurried back inside and opened her journal, writing furiously until her hand cramped. She tried to force the pieces to fit into the fear she knew, but they didn't. And as the afternoon sun poured through the window, lighting the barracks in soft gold, Ada realized with growing terror that the world outside Germany might not look the way she had been taught. And if that was true, then everything inside her was beginning to fracture. Ada could not sleep that night, no matter how many times she turned over or pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders. The barracks had quieted after roll call, the whispering of frightened women gradually fading into exhausted sleep, but Ada lay wide awake, staring into the dark with her eyes burning. Everything she had seen that day gnawed at her mind with relentless force. The warm stew, the gentle nurses, the oil rubbed into her dry skin, the calm soldiers who didn't shout or threaten, none of it matched the world she thought she understood. She had been raised on certainty. The Reich taught that enemies were predictable in their cruelty. But the Americans were worse in their unpredictability. They destabilized her simply by refusing to be monsters. And uncertainty, to Ada, felt like a battlefield with no map. She pushed herself upright and reached for her journal, lighting the smallest corner of a candle someone had passed around earlier. Its glow flickered across the wooden planks, casting trembling shadows. Ada opened her notebook to fresh pages and tried to write what she observed the entire evening. The guards changed shifts quietly. The nurses walked between barracks carrying blankets for women who were shivering. A cook had brought extra bread for the youngest prisoner. None of this aligned with brutal Americans in the propaganda films she had been forced to show her students. She wrote sentence after sentence, forcing the events into rigid descriptions, trying to make kindness look sinister. But the more she pressed her pen, the more her lines looked like doubts rather than warnings. She finally blew out the candle and slipped outside, hoping night air would calm her. The camp lay still beneath the Louisiana moon, silver beams catching on barbed wire and tall watchtowers. A lone guard paced along the fence, humming softly to himself. Ada froze, watching him. There was no aggression in his posture, no tension in his movements. He wasn't watching the women as prey. He walked like a man thinking about home. She felt her stomach twist again, a growing sickness formed not from fear of danger but fear of being wrong. The next morning, Ada kept to the back of the line during inspection, observing everything with ferocious intensity. The other women looked more rested. Greta even managed a faint smile when she was handed a fresh blanket. Ada felt her chest tighten with alarm. Smiling meant surrender. Smiling meant they were falling into the American trap. She whispered urgent warnings to Greta, insisting that the Americans were softening them before inflicting something terrible. But Greta only shook her head, her eyes softening with the kind of fragile hope Ada found unbearable. After breakfast, the women were taken to a yard behind the barracks where tables had been set up for sorting clothes. The sun was warm, the sky a deep blue, birds chirping in the trees. The setting felt absurdly peaceful for a prison camp. Ada clenched her fists, scanning every corner for violence. Instead, she saw a group of American soldiers handing out clean dresses and undergarments. One soldier, young and lanky, approached the line with a box full of folded garments. When he reached Ada, he set a dress in front of her and said, with a slight smile, "This one should fit." His accent was heavy, but his tone held no mockery. Ada didn't reach for the dress. She glared at him, waiting for the trick. The soldier blinked in confusion, then simply nodded and walked on. Ada stared after him, her pulse thudding painfully. No hostility. No hidden cruelty. Just a young man doing his duty. A sudden clatter caught her attention. Across the yard, the same soldier she had seen during lunch the previous day was kneeling near the fence, offering a rationed chocolate bar to the small German girl again. She accepted it with both hands, smiling shyly. The soldier ruffled her hair and said something that made her giggle. Ada's breath hitched. She turned away sharply, clutching her journal under her arm. She couldn't watch. She couldn't let herself see an American act human. Propaganda had filled her with commands, rules, diagrams of enemies that were simple and clear. But this was not simple. This was not clear. The soldier's kindness sliced through her defenses like a clean blade. She returned to the barracks before the others, pacing back and forth with mounting agitation. Her mind felt like a storm beating against fragile walls. She tried to rationalize what she saw. The Americans were probably following the Geneva Convention. They were performing for the Red Cross, keeping up an appearance. Maybe they weren't monsters. They were manipulators. Actors. That made sense. She clung to it desperately. But then something happened that stripped away even that excuse. Near the foot of her bunk lay a scrap of paper. Ada snatched it up, ready to scold whoever had left clutter. But when she saw the handwriting, her heartbeat stumbled. It wasn't German. It wasn't a prisoner's message. It was English. A letter. A soldier's letter home. Her eyes skimmed through the lines, simple sentences about missing his wife, worrying about his infant daughter, hoping the war ended soon. He described the German women with tired sympathy, mentioning their hunger, their trembling hands, and how he wished they didn't look so afraid. He wrote that he tried to give them extra bread because it reminded him of feeding his own child. Ada sank onto the bunk, staring at the letter as if it were poison. This was not a propaganda tool. This wasn't staged. This was a private, unguarded piece of someone's life, a life where she wasn't the enemy but a frightened human being. Her throat tightened painfully. Before she could think, she ripped the letter into small pieces and stuffed them deep into her journal. Her hands shook. Her breath shook. Her certainty shook. That evening, the women were marched to the bathhouse again. Steam billowed from the doorway, nurses waiting with towels and soap. The moment Ada stepped inside, the smell of warm water hit her, and something inside her snapped. She backed away, panic clawing up her spine. She shouted in German that it was a trap, that they were being prepared for experiments, that the Americans were lulling them into trust before striking. Other women tried to calm her, but she pushed them away, trembling violently. Nurse Tully held up her hands gently. "You're safe. I promise." Safe. The word again. The word that was tearing her apart. Ada's scream echoed off the tiled walls as her last line of internal defense cracked under the unbearable weight of truth she wasn't ready to face. Ada's scream had barely begun to fade when the room shifted, not with chaos, but with a deep, heavy stillness. Even the steam seemed to pause in the air. The women backed away startled, their eyes darting between Ada and the American nurses. No one grabbed her. No one shouted. No one forced her toward the bath. Their restraint only made her panic worse. She stumbled backward until her spine hit the cold tile wall, breath coming in sharp, broken pulls. She expected punishment now, some brutal retaliation finally revealing itself. She waited for the cruelty she had been trained to anticipate. But 15 seconds passed. Then 30. Then a full minute. And nothing happened. Footsteps approached, firm but unhurried. Ada's pulse hammered painfully against her ribs. The nurses parted, making a path. Colonel Joseph W. Scobie stepped through the steam and stopped a few feet in front of her. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not annoyed, not triumphant. His voice, when he spoke, came low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had done this far too many times in far too many wars. "Ma'am," he said, "nobody here will hurt you." Ada shook her head so violently that her hair whipped across her face. She clutched her journal to her chest like armor. Her knees trembled, threatening to buckle beneath her. Colonel Scobie did not move closer. He simply stood there, hands behind his back, giving her space to breathe. He wasn't playing a role. He wasn't delivering a rehearsed speech. His calmness was too natural, too practiced, too honest. And his eyes, steady, compassionate, unbearably human, broke something inside her that had held firm for years. "You don't understand," Ada whispered, her voice barely holding together. "We were told." She stopped, swallowing hard, afraid to finish the sentence. Afraid to admit how deeply she had believed the lies. Scobie nodded, as if he had heard similar confessions from countless prisoners before her. "You were told we were monsters," he said quietly. "We know." The simplicity of it disarmed her. He acknowledged her fear without dismissing it, without mocking it. He spoke as if her terror was understandable, even reasonable, given what she'd been told. Ada felt her throat constrict. She wanted to argue, to reject his words, to cling to the familiar structure of propaganda. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. Scobie turned slightly and gestured toward the nurses. "These women are here to help you. Nothing more. Nothing less." Then he looked at Ada directly. "You're safe. And you're not alone." Something hot pressed behind Ada's eyes. Rage, confusion, grief, she couldn't tell. But as she stared at him, the truth she had fought so desperately to avoid finally surged through her. The Americans were not what she had been taught. Not even close. She had built her identity on the certainty of American cruelty, and now that certainty was collapsing. She felt stripped bare, not by force, but by the unbearable contrast between what she had feared and what she had found. Her body sagged against the wall, exhaustion sweeping through her in a crushing wave. Scobie nodded to the nurses and stepped back, giving her space to choose. No pressure. No orders. Just patience. After nearly a full minute, Ada's trembling hand lifted slightly, the smallest gesture of surrender. Nurse Tully stepped forward slowly, gently, like approaching a wounded animal. "May I help you?" she asked softly. Ada's jaw tightened, but she gave the faintest nod. The nurse guided her to a bench beside the tubs. Warm steam curled around her, smelling faintly of lavender soap. Ada felt hands, not rough, not demanding, take her coat, her shoes. When warm water finally touched her skin, Ada's entire body flinched. But no pain followed. Only heat. Only cleansing. The nurse washed her hair with slow, careful strokes, speaking in a soothing voice Ada barely understood. The oil they used on her scalp reminded her of her mother gently untangling her hair as a child, long before the Reich had seized every corner of her life. Ada's throat tightened again, this time with something like grief. Grief for the girl she had been. Grief for the years she had taught lies she now feared were poison. Grief for the trust she had given to the wrong people. When she stepped out of the bath and into a clean towel, Ada felt lighter, not physically, but mentally, as if the water had washed away not dirt but pieces of fear clinging to her like soot. The nurse handed her a simple cotton dress, fresh and soft. Ada put it on quietly, no longer trembling, only unsteady from the emotional collapse that still echoed inside her. Later that day, Ada found herself sitting outside the barracks with Greta, both of them drying their hair in the warm Louisiana sun. For the first time since their capture, Greta smiled at her openly and said, "They're not what we thought." Ada didn't answer. Instead, she watched the camp around her with new eyes. The guards moved with casual ease. The cooks carried trays of food toward the infirmary. A nurse helped an elderly German woman walk. None of it matched the darkness Ada had expected. That evening, Ada opened her journal, intending to write her usual coded warnings. Instead, she stared at the blank page for a long time before finally writing, "I was wrong." She closed the journal quickly, as though ashamed of the confession. Weeks passed. The camp fell into a rhythm. Ada volunteered to help distribute bread to new arrivals, remembering her own terror and wanting to ease theirs. The American guards treated her with respect, nodding politely each time she walked by. She never fully trusted her surroundings. How could she, after so many years of indoctrination? But she no longer recoiled at the sight of American uniforms. She no longer expected cruelty in every gesture. She even began practicing English with Nurse Tully, stumbling over words but learning slowly, determined to understand the world more clearly than she had before. In May of 1945, the announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The camp erupted with emotion, sobs, laughter, disbelief. Ada stood still, staring at the dusty ground beneath her feet, unsure how to feel. Freedom was coming. But what did freedom mean now? What did home mean? On the morning of repatriation, the women lined up at the camp gates. Ada stepped forward slowly, each footstep heavy with conflict. Colonel Scobie waited near the exit, hands behind his back. When Ada reached him, she drew in a shaky breath and said, in halting English, "Thank you." Scobie nodded once. "Safe journey, Miss Newman." Ada hesitated, then turned and walked toward the trucks. But halfway there, she stopped and glanced back at Camp Ruston, the place she had feared most, yet the place where she had finally learned the truth about humanity. The truth she had never expected from her enemy.